Okay, welcome back to the fourth installment of the Black Death. This is a short segment, I hope, on the Jews. One of the features of epidemics is sometimes the desire to locate blame somewhere in a group of people and then punish them. And this, of course, happened no different in the 14th century and generally targeted Jews. So quickly, the readings that I will associate with this material is to revisit the chronicle written by Gilles de Mussis, the abbot of Tournai, who covers some of this material, and then I've also provided some readings on the persecution of the Jews that give some fragments of chronicles that are telling specifically about the targeting of the Jews. So it should be said that the advent of the Black Death unleashed violence, retributive violence across Europe, and to different groups. So in Sicily, they targeted the Catalans, a bunch of foreigners that were resented. Some towns in southern France, there's evidence of attacks on clergy and beggars, sometimes prostitutes, and lepers were often a problematic social outcast group that was targeted. But by far, the most common target were the European Jewry. Well over 1,000 Jewish communities over the course of the 47 through 51 epidemic were targeted, and Jews in massive numbers were sequestered, locked up in their houses or their synagogues, and burnt to death. And what's almost worse is that the communities, local communities, town communities, mobilized their law courts in order to give the scapegoating kind of judicial legitimacy, always with the use of torture. So in 1340, here I just remind this image of the scourging of Christ. Of course, the flagellation, the torment of Christ, obviously done by Roman soldiers, increasingly imagined actually as Jews, and a caricature, anti-Semitic caricature of Jews and Judaism appearing in medieval art at precisely this time, is informing the ethic by which this happens, or the aesthetic by which this happens. So in 1340, there were Jews spread out all over Europe, mostly in urban centers. What you're seeing here is actually a map of Jewish communities dotting into past from 1100 through about 1700, so passing our period, but centered in urban towns because they were not allowed to own or till land, clustered in cities, often engaged in money lending, which Christians were forbidden to do by canon law, but a growing economy required, and making up apparently about 1% of the total population of Christendom, or of Western Europe. The Black Death gave rise to a phenomenon of burning Jews across German-speaking lands, Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, the Low Countries, Spain, in this period. In part, this linked into the apocalypticism that we spoke about in the last section. Here I'm just showing you an image of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. You see there are 6 horsemen there, so I'll have to figure that one out. Anyhow, this linked into the apocalypticism that we spoke about in the last section, because apocalyptic prophecy dictated that Jews would witness, were required to witness, and thus needed to be there for the onset of the second coming, the Jews needed to be either converted or entirely eradicated before Christ could return for his 1,000-year reign, for the millenarian expectations. And so it is possible that in some versions of this, the idea of the mass eradication or conversion of Jews was part of the apocalyptic drama. Anti-Jewish violence was not new in the 14th century. It goes back forever. But in European history, it had started about 4 centuries earlier when the Jews had become targets of mass violence, particularly in German-speaking regions, starting with the First Crusade. So at the very end of the 11th century, Jews were targeted and massacred in a design to kind of cleanse or purify Europe before going off on the crusade. And this notion of, again, cleansing, purification is part of that reform dynamic that we spoke about last time, and the sort of social sin context, that sort of discourse that we saw in religious responses. To justify these series of targeted violence against Jewish communities, not individual Jews as much as the communities, they were often accused of cannibalism or ritual murder, of desecrating the host, sometimes of partnering with Muslims and lepers or even demons to harm Christians. And starting in the 12th century, we see a particularly venomous accusation develop that takes hold and is made repeatedly up through modern times, and that's the blood libel. The blood libel was the accusation that Jews would kill a Christian, and usually a Christian child, in order to harvest their blood for their own religious rites. It was sort of an inversion, an imagined inversion of Christian Eucharistic sacrifice, the Eucharistic ritual. And it could get quite frenzied and would result periodically in a series of inquests and then execution of individual Jews. And so very, very quickly after the outbreak of the plague in areas spreading across Europe, people began leveling the accusation that Jews were responsible for the Black Death, causing the Black Death. Particularly in the accusation was that they were poisoning the wells and the water supplies, and that was making people sick. And so this links into the medical theory of the miasma, the poisoned air, and you see that actually in the Gilles de Mussis piece that I gave you. Often, usually this was done in the wake of an epidemic, but as news spread of the disease, communities began massacring their Jewish populations before the arrival of the plague in hopes of warding it off. So it's particularly insidious. And so one instance is the city of Strasbourg, and you have the evidence of that in your reading, which burned alive 20,000 Jews before the plague had arrived the city, in an attempt to kind of expiate the sin before the punishment. So it used to be argued, kind of in a Marxist vein of interpretation, that anti-Jewish violence was the purview of like the rabble-rousing, hysterical lower class, the mob or the artisan and peasantry. That the massacres were spontaneous and the expression of heightened passions. But in an article that came out about 15 years ago, Samuel Cohen, a great authority, argued in fact that what you're actually seeing is violence organized and perpetrated by local elites. And what you see, and you'll see this when you read the sources, it actually seems pretty clear, that the gears of government and legal authority were simply put in the service of persecution. Authorities weren't interested in individual confessions, but they were interested in proving kind of international conspiracy. This is clear in the confessions from Savoy, which are quite long. I've given it to you. You can look at some of that. Plentiful testimony shows that leading Jews from the cities, from individual cities, were rounded up, and the euphemism is put to the question, right? Was put to torture, often on the wheel, and they would often implicate an entire community. And thus the entire community was sentenced to death. Jews across Europe were burned, usually. This is an image from 1493 of the Jewish community being burned in a pit in, I think this is the Strasbourg event. Sometimes in their synagogues, sometimes in a pit that was dug, sometimes they were locked in the ghettos. where they were confined and executed. We do see some resistance. For instance, the city of Cologne, the city council expressed belief in the innocence of the Jewish community. In another town, the guild-based government expressed some doubts for the poison. Some kings and authority, like the Duke of Austria, also resisted the pressure to persecute. The most famous of which was the Pope. So quite early on, you can see in July and then in September of 1348, he issues a bull, Sicut Judaeus, designed to protect the Jews, from precisely this kind of violence. And it's a fairly long document. And it argues that Jews were actually dying alongside Christians of the plague. And there were Christians that were dying of plague in communities where there were no Jews. And thus it cannot be true that Jews were responsible for the plague, but rather, and this is interesting, he says on 2 occasions that the plague was caused by God not because of the Jews, but because of the sins of the Christian people. So here we're going back to that earlier or more basic interpretation that this is caused by Christian sin, not Jewish malfeasance. On the other hand, other leaders saw opportunities to profit from the extermination of the Jews, mostly to cancel out debts because, of course, the Jews were the source of financial loans. Charles IV of Bohemia, for instance, arranged that the disposal of all Jewish property, he arranged for the disposal of all Jewish property and granted immunity to leading burghers after the execution of the community. And then, of course, anyone who survived was relieved of any of their wealth, and it was brought into local hands. And so, it is a typical moment of scapegoating, of an attempt to blame the Jews for the misfortunes of mankind, to prove an international and coordinated conspiracy against the Christians, and to use this as an excuse for mass extermination. Should be said that these attacks, the worst attacks, occurred in that first bout in 1348 through 51, and then thankfully they did not recur in number or magnitude after that first plague. So we know that plague recurred quite repeatedly, but these subsequent attacks did not repeat in a widespread manner. There were localized attacks in particular communities at a various later moments in time, but in general it did not repeat in the widespread fashion that it had before. That's it. See you next time.